Hello guys and girls, and welcome to today's video. As you can see here on the screen, the topic that we're going to be talking about today is counterargument paragraphs. So as you guys know, over the past several weeks, we have been diving into the different parts of an on-demand. We've talked about introduction paragraphs, we've talked about body paragraphs, and then our focus this week is going to be all about the counterargument paragraph. Before we jump in here and get started, there are a couple things that we need to make sure that we have ready to go. First of all, you are going to be taking some notes today. If you see something highlighted in the color red, it is important and is something that you need to pay attention to. And it's going to be something that likely needs to be added to your note-taking sheet. So please be aware of that. Make sure you're taking notes. And on the note of your note-taking sheet, you should already have a guided set of notes for this video today. So you need to make sure you have that ready to go. Preferably, it would be glued into your language arts notebook, but I do know that some of you guys like to take the notes first and then glue them in your notebook after, which is totally fine. Just make sure in the very near future, especially before you leave today, that those notes do get glued into your notebook. With all of that being said, we are ready to jump in here and get started and talk about what exactly is a counter-argument paragraph. So, counter-arguments. When you are writing an argument essay, for us, that's an on-demand essay, we know that you make a claim based on your opinion. So we've talked about thesis statements. We've talked about how when we are given an on-demand writing prompt, we have to choose a side of the debate, and then we have to write our thesis statement, and we have to provide two reasons for why we feel that way, two reasons to support our opinion. When we counter-argue, when we get to the counter-argument paragraph, we have to consider if someone was going to argue against us. In other words, if someone had a thesis statement that was the opposite of ours, what might they say? And then what kind of aspect or reasoning could we use to prove them wrong? So when we are writing a counter-argument paragraph, we're going to ask ourselves, if someone was arguing against me, what would their argument be? And how can I prove either that A, my argument is stronger, or B, my argument is right and their argument is wrong? We've been talking about each paragraph as if it were a shape. Remember, we said if the introduction paragraph were a shape, it would be an upside down triangle with our hook, our background information, and our thesis statement. We've said that our body paragraphs would be a rectangle with a transition word and a topic sentence, an E1 and E2, an internal transition with another E1 and an E2, and a concluding sentence. And with our counter-argument paragraph, I actually want you to know that counter-argument paragraphs are one of your body paragraphs. And so the shape of the counter-argument is the same shape as what our previous two body paragraphs are going to be about. Really, the major difference between the counter-argument and your other body paragraphs is how the counter-argument begins. So remember, with a regular body paragraph, we start with a transition word, maybe first or second or next, and then we write a topic sentence, which is based on the ideas presented in our thesis statement, and then we jump into our E1s and our E2s and our concluding sentence. With a counter-argument paragraph, we actually start with the opposing argument, meaning, like we just talked about, we start by stating an opposing viewpoint. So someone, if they were arguing against us, what might they say? That's the opposing viewpoint. And then we follow that with our counter-argument. Our counter-argument is the argument that we make to prove that the opposing viewpoint is weak or that the opposing viewpoint is wrong. What's nice about the rest of the counter-argument is that it follows the exact same pattern, the exact same steps as our previous two body paragraphs. So we start with an E1. Remember, E1 is our evidence. So we go back to the passage and we cite a piece of evidence that proves that our counter-argument is true. Then we follow that E1 with an E2, which is our explanation. Remember, we want our E2s to be at least two sentences. So two sentences explaining how our evidence supports our counter-argument. Then we provide an internal transition, which could be something like additionally or furthermore. And we provide a second E1, so we go back to the text. We find another piece of textual evidence that supports our counter-argument. Another E2 explaining how this second piece of evidence supports the counter-argument. argument. Remember, the E2s come from our brain while the E1s come from the passage. And then at the end of the counter argument paragraph, we provide a concluding sentence that wraps up our ideas. So since the counter-argument paragraph actually starts a little bit differently than a typical body paragraph, I wanted to provide you guys with some sentence starters that you could use when you're writing your own counter-argument paragraph. There are several options here. If it were me, remember with on-demand writing, I've said several times that it's actually better to work smarter and not harder. So I would memorize a couple of these, and then I would just use the one or two that I memorize every single time that I'm writing a counter argument paragraph. So, like I said, with a regular body paragraph, you start with a transition word and a topic sentence. But with a counter argument paragraph, you start with the opposing viewpoint, and then you provide your counter argument. So here's how you might do that. You might start by saying something like, while some may say, dot, 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 this is not the case because, dot, dot, dot. And so on this particular slide of notes, where you see these dot, dot, dots, is where you would insert your own information. So while some may say, this is where you would put the opposing argument. This is not the case because, and after the word because is where you would provide your counter argument. Another option might be, while it is true that blank, so insert the opposing viewpoint, this argument is weak because blank, and that's where you would insert your counter argument. Some may argue that, dot, 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 you would put in the opposing argument. However, you would insert your counter argument here. There is some truth to, dot, dot, dot. Remember, you would insert that opposing viewpoint there. However, and then you would insert your counter argument. And then your final option might be something like, while some people believe blank, remember in that first blank after the word believe is where you would insert the opposing viewpoint. This is not good because blank, and you would insert your counter argument there. After you give your opposing viewpoint and your counter argument, the next step is to provide counter arguments and counter evidence. So again, like I've said several times, this is your opportunity to prove the opposing side wrong. So like we've talked about, you're going to start by giving a piece of evidence from the text that opposes the opposite argument. So it's your opportunity to pull in some evidence from the passage that proves that you are right and that the other side is wrong. And then anytime we have an E1, anytime we have a piece of evidence, we always follow that with our E2, which is our explanation. And with your E2s, you are explaining how the evidence that you provided, again, proves that you are right and that the other person is wrong. And remember, we want to do that twice when we're writing our counter argument. Just like our body paragraphs, we're always going to have two E1s, so two pieces of evidence to support our counter argument, and two E2s following our E1s. All right, so let's talk about where the counter argument should go. If you are writing a completely written on-demand essay, it is going to be body paragraph number 3, okay? So we start with the introduction paragraph, our hook, our background, our thesis. Then we have our 2 regular body paragraphs, which we get the ideas for those from our thesis statement. We have a topic sentence, E1, E2, internal transition, E1, E2, and a concluding sentence. We do that twice. And then the 3rd body paragraph is our counter argument paragraph, where we introduce an opposing viewpoint and then we prove it wrong. Here's an example of a counter argument paragraph. And you're actually going to be annotating this exact same counter argument paragraph tomorrow, but we're actually going to take a look at it together right now, and then we're going to go through and we're going to talk about the different parts of this counter argument. All I need you to do is follow along with me while I read this to you. Some argue that they would like to visit the Titanic so that they can see and experience an important part of history. However, what they fail to realize is how dangerous this experience would actually be. The text says, "The deep sea is an unforgiving place. Outside the protection of a submersible, the deep ocean is pitch black and nearly freezing. There are so many things that could go wrong while visiting the wreckage of the Titanic because we know very little about what actually lives in the deep ocean. In fact, at this point in history, only about 5% of it has even been explored. It's important to remember that the submersible could be damaged by the water pressure at this depth, not to mention the sea life living there. Furthermore, the text says, oceans cover more than 2/3 of our planet, yet we know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the ocean floor. Can you imagine all of the dangers that may be lurking near the Titanic wreckage? There could very well be sea creatures that have yet to be discovered that may pose a serious risk to travelers visiting the bottom of the ocean. Is visiting the Titanic really worth risking your life? So, if we break this down and talk about the different parts of a counter argument paragraph, the first part of the first sentence is the opposing viewpoint. So, this counter argument paragraph is a person who is debating whether or not it would be worth hopping on a submarine and going to visit the wreckage of the Titanic. This person is of the opinion that this is a bad idea. So, for the opposing argument, they had to think about if someone was going to argue that visiting the Titanic is a good idea, what might they say? What would their viewpoint be? And so this person chose to say that someone might like to visit the Titanic so that they can see and experience a part of history. That's the opposing viewpoint. Right after the opposing viewpoint, keep in mind this is the same sentence. We're still in the first sentence of the paragraph. This person has given a counter argument. So they're giving a reason why that's not a good idea to go to the Titanic. And their reason is because it would be very dangerous. If we're following the format of all of our other body paragraphs, this is where we get into the flow of what we're used to. So now they are providing an E1. Remember, E1 is our evidence. And this piece of evidence needs to support the idea that visiting the Titanic would be dangerous. They have a good sentence starter. They say the text says. They have quotation marks to show that this came from the passage. And their evidence is the deep sea is an unforgiving place, and outside the protection of a submersible, the deep ocean is pitch black and nearly freezing. After this E1, they're jumping right into an E2. So remember, E1's the evidence is quoted from the text, and the E2 comes from your brain. So here are several sentences explaining how this piece of evidence shows us that visiting the Titanic is dangerous. And this is written in this person's own words. It's not copied from the text. There are so many things that could go wrong while visiting the wreckage of the Titanic because we know very little about what actually lives in the deep ocean. In fact, at this point in history, only about 5% of it has even been explored. So remember, in their E1, it said that the deep sea is an unforgiving place. And so now this person is explaining why it would be so dangerous to visit the deep ocean. It's important to remember that the submersible could be damaged by the water pressure at this depth, not to mention the sea life living there. Now we have an internal transition. Remember, that is just a word that's going to help our audience move from our first E1 and E2 to our second E1 and E2. This person used the transition furthermore. And now they're going to provide another piece of evidence that proves that visiting the Titanic would be extremely dangerous. So they say, furthermore, the text says, we have our quotation marks to show that this came from the passage. Oceans cover more than 2/3 of our planet, yet we know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the ocean floor. Now we're jumping into another E2 where we're explaining how this piece of evidence proves that visiting the Titanic would be dangerous. Can you imagine all of the dangers that may be lurking near the Titanic wreckage? There could very well be sea creatures that have yet to be discovered. Remember, we said that we don't know very much about the ocean floor, so this person is giving an example of why that might be dangerous. So there could very well be sea creatures that have yet to be discovered that may pose a serious risk to travelers visiting the bottom of the ocean. And then just like our body paragraphs that we talked about before, we always want to end with a concluding sentence, something to just wrap up our ideas. This person chose to end with a question, which is a technique that I love to use because it leaves your audience with something to think about at the end of the paragraph. And they said, is visiting the Titanic really worth risking your life? Again, at the beginning, they said it was dangerous. So at the end, they're reminding their audience that you could potentially not make it back if you chose to go visit the wreckage of the Titanic. Okay, that is it for the notes for today. You should have everything on your guided note-taking sheet filled out. And we're going to jump in here to a few questions. You can use your notes to help you with this last part today to answer the questions, and then you'll be ready to move on to your next assignment.